fierce Viking warrior with a thick beard and fur cloak stands in a misty forest, holding a large sword towards the camera. A polished steel sword lying on a rough wooden table. Camera focuses on the blade's shine and intricate guard. A Viking blacksmith warrior sitting by a fire wiping his sword blade with a cloth inside a wooden longhouse. Hands mixing a reddish paste in a small clay bowl using a wooden spoon by firelight. Hands applying the reddish paste to a sword blade with a piece of leather on a blacksmith anvil. Warrior inspecting his sword by the fire, wiping it clean with a dark cloth. Hands applying the red polish and paste onto the sword blade again under detailed texture lighting. Warrior cleaning the blade. Cut to him standing tall with the sword in a scabbard. Viking warrior drawing his sword from a leather scabbard with a Viking village in the background. Viking raising his sword in triumph. Cut to him sitting by fire examining the blade. Detailed shot of a sword hilt and guard with intricate engravings lying on a fur rug. Hand sheathing a sword into a leather scabbard lined with wool by firelight. Cross-section view of a sword scabbard showing layers, wood, wool lining, and sword blade inside. Detailed shot of a sword in a scabbard with fur trim. Camera pans along the leather texture. A hand pulling a sword out of a wool-lined scabbard. The wool is visible at the opening. Viking warrior holding his sword horizontally, examining the runes on the blade in a snowy forest. A sword in a leather scabbard resting near a campfire with a warm fire glow. Hands holding a sheathed sword, showing the wool lining around the guard in a dim interior. Extreme close-up of Damascus's steel pattern on a sword blade with high contrast detail. Viking walking through a misty pine forest with his sword at his hip, mist swirling around. A Viking warrior riding a brown horse through rocky terrain, sword and scabbard at his hip bouncing slightly. Close-up of the scabbard opening, thick sheepskin wool lining visible around the sword blade. Warrior drawing his sword halfway out, condensation droplets visible on the cold steel in morning light. A sword blade resting on fur, water droplets beating on the oiled surface reflecting firelight. Hands crafting a scabbard, fitting wooden slats together over a wool lining in a dusty workshop. Tool carving intricate knotwork designs into the leather covering of a scabbard. Attaching a metal tip shape to the bottom of the leather scabbard on a blacksmith anvil. Detail of the scabbard throat showing a reinforced leather and metal roller mechanism. Viking sheathing his sword smoothly. The blade slides into the wool-lined scabbard without cutting the leather, pouring oil from a clay jug into the opening of the scabbard to soak the wool. Sliding the sword into an oil-soaked wool scabbard. Oil glistens at the opening. Warrior holding a beautifully decorated scabbard, admiring the craftsmanship inside a longhouse. Hands using a bone tool to smooth and burnish the leather of the scabbard. Blacksmith examining a sword blade for imperfections, running a thumb along the flat in a forge. Detailed shot of an ornate sword hilt and scabbard resting on a fur pelt in a rustic interior. Hands stitching the leather seam of the scabbard with a thick needle and thread. Blacksmith hammering a red-hot blade on an anvil, sparks flying in a dark forge. Extreme close-up of a damaged sword edge with nicks and chips with battlefield mud background. A damaged sword blade lying in mud and dirt in the aftermath of a battlefield. Viking warrior in battle, sword clashing against a shield, sparks flying in a smoky battlefield. A sword striking a wooden shield, cutting deep into the rim but getting stuck for a moment. A warrior's hand pulling a stuck sword free from a wooden shield. Splinters fly in harsh sunlight. Macro view of the sword edge showing a fresh, jagged chip in the steel. Warrior sitting on a log taking a small whetstone from a leather pouch on his belt. Hands running the small whetstone along the damaged edge of the blade with rhythmic strokes. The whetstone grinding against the steel, metal dust and filings appearing on the stone. Warrior checking the edge with his thumb carefully after sharpening by a campfire. A small rectangular stone pendant hanging around a Viking's neck over chainmail texture. Warrior grabbing the stone pendant and using it to quickly touch up his sword edge mid-battle. Hands using the small pendant stone to smooth out a burr on the blade in a field setting. Sparks flying as a sword is sharpened on a larger grinding wheel in a forge. Warrior wiping sweat from his brow, looking at his restored blade with satisfaction in a forest camp. Rubbing a smooth river stone against the flat of the blade to polish it near water. Viking hammering a bent sword tip on a small field anvil or flat rock. Hammer striking the cold steel sword tip, the metal straightening slightly on a rock surface. Warrior sighting down the length of the blade to check for straightness in a forest. Using the heel of a smaller knife to burnish and smooth out scratches on the sword. Warrior applying final touches to the edge with a leather strap belt by a warm campfire. The sword slicing cleanly through a piece of fabric or leather after repair in slow motion. Group of Vikings sitting around a night fire, all maintaining their weapons, talking and laughing. Warrior's hands forcefully rubbing a smooth stone along the flat of the sword blade to straighten a dent. Warrior sighting down the blade again, nodding slightly as the edge looks straighter. Warrior looking around alertly, then quickly returning to work on the sword, conveying urgency. Using a rough stone to grind out a small nick near the tip of the blade while sitting on a log. Macro shot of sparks or metal dust falling onto the warrior's leather trousers. Warrior unbuckling his leather belt or pulling a strap taut between his hand and foot. Stropping the sword edge against the taut leather belt with rhythmic Birkenforth motion. Extreme close-up of the blade edge sliding against the leather, polishing the metal and removing the burr. Warrior testing the edge on his thumbnail or a piece of hair after stropping by firelight. Evening falls. A group of Vikings sitting in a circle around a large fire, all working on their gear. Audio visualization, rhythmic sound of stone on metal. Visual of a warrior sharpening in rhythm by firelight. Two warriors talking, one pointing at the other's sword, offering advice or instruction. An older, scarred warrior showing a younger one how to hold the whetstone correctly. The younger warrior nodding and imitating the movement on his own sword by the campfire. A dull, chipped blade being inspected, Other warriors laughing or jeering in the background. A warrior looking ashamed of his dull blade, hurriedly starting to sharpen it. A pristine, well-maintained sword reflecting the flames, contrasting with the dull one. Warrior inspecting a sword for rust spots near the guard in a misty, humid forest morning. Extreme close-up of reddish rust forming on the steel blade, showing pitting. Hands grabbing a handful of wet sand or soil from the ground near a riverbank. Hands scrubbing a steel blade with a piece of rough cloth and sand to remove rust spots. Applying a layer of animal fat or lard onto the clean blade to seal the metal. Macro shot of a small crack or crumbling on the sword edge, showing metal fatigue. Warrior inspecting his sword closely, frowning as he discovers deep damage. Finger tracing near a deep nick in the blade, hesitating to sharpen it. Warrior lowering the sword, deciding not to repair it himself, looking towards a village forge. A damaged blade being heated in a forge fire, flash forward to professional repair. Extreme close-up of the sword blade snapping or breaking under stress visualization. Warrior carefully sheathing the damaged sword to protect it until it can be fixed. Warrior picking up a secondary weapon like an axe or knife since the sword is compromised. An older Viking warrior teaching a younger one, pointing at the sword edge to convey wisdom. Sharpness test scene. A bundle of wool hanging from a wooden beam in bright sunlight. Viking swinging a sword at the floating wool bundle. The blade slices through cleanly in slow motion. The wool bundle falling apart in two halves, fibers floating in the air. Warrior placing the edge of his sword gently against his thumbnail for the nail test. Extreme close-up of the sharp blade catching into the nail surface without sliding. Extreme close-up of a dull blade sliding harmlessly off the thumbnail for comparison. Warrior preparing to cut a piece of linen cloth hanging freely from a branch in the forest. The sword slashing through the hanging fabric effortlessly without dragging it. Warrior approaching a hanging animal carcass for a penetration test in a butchery area. A Viking warrior delivering a powerful cleaving blow with a broadsword into a hanging animal carcass. The sword blade striking a hard bone placed on a wooden stump. Chips of bone flying. Macro view of the sword edge after hitting the bone, showing a small dent but no catastrophic failure. A blacksmith nodding in approval as he examines the blade's edge integrity after the test. A row of Vikings raising beer horns and a toast, celebrating a successful weapon test at sunset. A warrior laughing and swinging his sword to slice a thin wooden pole planted in the ground. The wooden pole fallen cleanly in two pieces, smooth cut surface visible. Another warrior looking embarrassed at his dull sword which failed to cut, others jeering playfully. A hand wiping a pristine, well-oiled blade with a rag. The steel gleams blue-gray. Macro shot of a cracked sword blade. Visual FX showing the crack propagating through the metal grain. A seasoned warrior shaking his head and putting a damaged sword away, refusing to use it. Hands tying a peace knot or securing a damaged weapon into its scabbard permanently. The Viking landscape fades into a modern-day wilderness setting with same river and mountains. A modern bushcrafter in a flannel shirt sharpening a hunting knife on a wet stone by a river. Modern hands performing the exact same circular sharpening motion as the Vikings did. Water and gray metal slurry or mud forming on the surface of a whetstone. A modern artisan in a leather apron examining a knife edge under a warm electrical lamp. A high-quality modern hunting knife slicing through a piece of paper effortlessly. The modern craftsman wiping the blade, mirroring the Vikings' earlier action. The convex lens-shaped edge of a modern blade reflecting light in the dark. Extreme close-up of the convex edge of a modern blade reflecting light, showing sharpening geometry. A modern bushcrafter using a natural river stone to sharpen a knife, mimicking ancient technique. Viking warrior by a campfire, checking the edge of his sword against the warm firelight. Modern hands wiping a blade with a cloth, transitioning visually to Viking hands doing the same. Viking warrior sheathing his sword into the wool-lined scabbard with a satisfying slide. Blacksmith in a dark forge striking red-hot iron, high-contrast orange sparks filling the frame. Water being poured over a whetstone. Sludge and mud forming on the surface. Viking warrior sitting thoughtfully, holding his sword across his knees overlooking a fjord. A modern knife cutting thin shavings of wood feather stick effortlessly outdoors. A Viking testing his sword on a piece of leather, slicing it cleanly by firelight. A modern craftsman working at a grinder with industrial sparks flying. The face of a Viking warrior, dirty and scarred, looking at his weapon with respect. A modern person sheathing a high-quality knife into a leather sheath in the woods. Viking warrior walking away from the camera into a snowy forest at twilight. Final shot of a sword resting on an anvil with a hammer next to it under dying fire embers. Dense, ancient Scandinavian oak forest, mist clinging to the mossy ground with shafts of light. A bearded master shipbuilder walking slowly, touching the bark of massive oak trees. The master stops at a perfect curved tree naturally shaped for ship ribs, nodding in discovery. Men felling the giant oak with heavy iron axes, wood chips flying in slow motion. The tree crashing to the forest floor, shaking the ground with dust rising. Splitting the log radially, using wedges and mallets to preserve wood grain. Macro view. Animation overlay showing how riving preserves the wood grain versus sawing. Hewing the plank smooth with a broad axe, shavings curling off beautifully in sunlight. Laying the T-shaped keel backbone on the building blocks. Wide symmetrical shot. A blacksmith forging iron rivets, sparks flying in the dark orange glow of the forge. Placing one plank overlapping the one below it for clinker construction. Side profile. Driving the iron rivet through the two planks and hammering the rove on the inside. Inserting wool soaked in pine tar between the planks for waterproofing. Extreme close-up. The hull taking shape, looking like a skeleton of a sea monster against a sunset. Heating a plank over a fire to twist it into place at the bow. Steam bending technique. Installing internal ribs, lashing them with spruce roots instead of nailing for flexibility. A master carver using a fine chisel to create the dragon head prow. Detail on the eye. Applying a final coat of dark wood tar mixed with charcoal to the entire glossy black hull. Women spinning wool and weaving the massive square sail on a vertical loom. Rubbing horse fat and ochre onto the wool sail to make it windproof and vivid red. Raising the massive central mast using ropes and a pulley system, men pulling together. Securing the mast and the mast step on the keel, showing the intricate locking mechanism. Braiding thick ropes from walrus hide and hemp for the standing rigging. Texture detail. Attaching the shrouds and stays to the mast top and whole sides to stabilize it. Rolling the finished red wool sail and carrying it towards the ship on a long pole. The finished longship sitting on rollers on the beach, dragon head prow facing the sea. A chieftain performing a blood sacrifice on the stem post for good fortune and somber light. Men pushing the ship down the greased logs towards the water, grunting with effort. The moment the hull touches the water for the first time, splashing foam at water level. The ship floating perfectly level in the calm harbor water with reflection visible. Crew boarding the ship, placing their sea chests which double as rowing benches. Sliding the long oars out through the oar ports in the whole side, rhythmic motion. The ship rowing out of the harbor, oars hitting the water in unison, white wake forming. Hoisting the square sail for the first time. It catches the wind and billows out dramatically. The ship accelerating rapidly under sail, bow cutting through the waves with spray flying. The clinker hull visibly flexing and twisting slightly as it rides over a large swell. Animation overlay showing forces being distributed along the flexible hull versus a rigid hull. The ship tacking against the wind using the Baitia spar to push the sail edge forward. The steersman controlling the large side rudder at the stern with precise ease. The ship sailing into the sunset on the open ocean, leaving a long wake behind. Split screen comparison. Sleek warship cutting water versus wide cargo narbobbing heavily. Longship detail. Low freeboard packed with warriors. Shields lining the side for menace. Nar detail. High sides, deep open cargo hold filled with barrels, furs, and livestock. The Langskiff sailing up a very shallow river, scraping the sandy bottom but keeping moving. Warriors jumping directly from the landskip onto a riverbank for an amphibious landing. The Nar struggling in the same shallow river, getting stuck due to its deep draft. Nar in the ocean, massive wave crashing over the bow, but high sides keep water out. The landskip in the same storm taking on water, crew bailing furiously with buckets. Loading a horse onto the Inar using a primitive crane hoist system at the dock. Stacking dried fish and walrus ivory into the hold of the Inar. Texture of goods. A fleet of Langskips moving in formation in open water, looking like a wolf pack hunting. Close-up of the dragon head on the prow painted in bright colors to scare land spirits. removing the dragon head as they approach a friendly port to not offend local spirits. Anar arriving at a bustling international trading port full of masts and smoke. Map overlay showing red lines for coastal warship routes and blue lines for ocean nars. The sheer speed of a langskip under full sail overtaking a slower merchant vessel. Interior of the Nair's small shelter deck where the crew sleeps out of the rain. Repairing a leak in the Nair at sea using tallow and wool. Urgent maintenance work. A langskip being portaged overland by the crew rolling it on logs between two rivers. Sunset shot of the two ship types anchored side by side, silhouettes distinct against the sun. Endless 360-degree horizon of the North Atlantic Ocean, deep blue water with no land in sight. The navigator standing at the stern, squinting at the midday sun with intense focus. Using a wooden sun shadow board floating in a bowl of water to keep it level. Thick gray fog rolling in, obscuring the sun and horizon completely. Visibility drops to 0. The navigator pulls out a pouch containing a transparent sunstone crystal. Holding the calcite crystal up to the gray overcast sky, it glows slightly. POV through the crystal, rotating it until a double refraction pattern reveals the sun's location, the navigator pointing confidently to true north despite the swirling fog. Releasing a raven from a cage, it circles and flies straight ahead, indicating land. Clouds clearing at night to reveal the North Star fixed above the mast tip. Ice forming on the beards and eyebrows of the crew in the freezing night. Crew sleeping in leather bags on the open wet deck, huddled together for warmth. Morning routine, eating dried stockfish and hard bread with no fire for cooking. Ocean watercolor changing from deep blue to lighter turquoise, indicating a shallow shelf. Spotting a pod of whales swimming in a specific direction following the current. A massive rogue wave appearing out of nowhere, towering over the ship in a storm. The ship climbing the face of the giant wave, almost vertical with spray and foam. Surfing down the back of the wave, the rudder groaning under pressure in the trough. Frantic bailing, crew using wooden buckets to throw water out of the hull to avoid sinking. The storm passing, the navigator smelling the air, inhaling the scent of pine and earth. A flock of gannets diving into the water nearby, signaling land is close. The fog lifting to reveal the lush green coastline of Vinland, North America. Sailing up a narrow, calm river, inlet with pine trees reflecting in the mirror like water. Running the ship directly onto the sandy riverbank without a harbor. Amphibious landing. Crew jumping off and pulling the ship higher up the beach using logs as rollers. Flipping a smaller ship upside down to use as a roof for a temporary winter shelter. Time lapse of seasons changing from snowy winter to blooming spring around the ship shelter. Animated map with red lines exploding from Scandinavia to Russia, Constantinople, and America. Transition to a grand burial of a chieftain ship in blue clay. Gloomy lighting. Layers of earth and stone covering the wood. Darkness closing in from inside the grave? Modern excavation, 1904. Black and white fading to color as archaeologists brush dirt off the ship. Inside the Viking ship museum, the restored ship standing majestically under spotlights. Extreme close-up of a 1,000-year-old iron rivet, rusted but still holding the oak planks. Modern shipbuilders using ancient axes and techniques to build the Draken Harald Herfagar. The modern reconstructed Viking ship sailing in the Atlantic today, crashing through huge waves. Match cut, the face of an ancient Viking navigator morphing into a modern sailor's face. Top-down view of the wake left by the ship, creating a perfect hydrodynamic V-shape. Surreal shot of the dragon-head prow coming alive with glowing eyes and faint smoke. A ghost fleet of hundreds of long ships appearing transparently on the horizon at sunset. The sun setting directly behind the single square sail, creating a perfect silhouette. Symbolic shot of an axe and a compass lined together on a modern map. Final look at the open ocean, empty but full of possibility. Static wide shot. Credits background, texture of weathered oak wood with runic carvings glowing faintly. Credits background, sparks from a forge rising up into darkness in slow motion. The screen fading to black as the sound of a single heavy oar stroke hits the water.